The heavy bronze doors of the Hall of 10,000 Years groaned as they parted, a sound that usually heralded the arrival of a conquering general or a divine omen. Instead, a small, rhythmic clack, clack, clack echoed against the marble. Lee Seol-Hwa stepped into the cavernous room, her eyes fixed on the small wooden spinning top dancing across the floor ahead of her. She followed it with a light, skipping step, her simple silk skirts fluttering. She looked like a stray petal blown into a war room. At the far end of the hall, the Prime Minister Park Geun-Shik stood before the high altar of the throne. He was surrounded by 50 of the empire's most powerful men, ministers whose faces were etched with the exhaustion of the manufactured famine and the fear of the border wars. They had been mid-shout, arguing over a decree that would strip the Empress of her title, for the safety of the realm. The silence that fell was vacuum-sealed. Seol-Hwa reached down, scooped up her toy, and popped a small honey candy into her mouth. She looked up at the assembly, her face radiating a bright, vacant curiosity. "Is the meeting over?" she asked, her voice high and youthful. "I was told there would be sweet cakes left over. My father always said the ministers eat the best cakes when they are worried." Prime Minister Park stepped forward, his silver robes shimmering. He didn't bow, he barely tilted his head. "Your Majesty, we are discussing the survival of the Empire. It is heavy business. Perhaps you should return to the gardens? The lilies are in bloom." "The lilies are drowning in the rain, Minister Park," Seol-Hwa said, tilting her head. She walked toward the center of the room, the 12 Silent Custodians moving behind her like a single ink-black shadow. Their presence was a cold draft that made the ministers pull their robes tighter. She stopped at the edge of the Prime Minister's table, where a map of the starving southern provinces was laid out. She reached into her sleeve and pulled something out. "I found this in my tea bowl this morning," she said, her tone conversational, as if complaining about a fly. She dropped a blood-stained gold coin onto the map. It landed with a dull thud directly over the southern provinces. The ministers leaned in, then recoiled. It was the personal currency of the Prime Minister's private estate, the kind used to pay for discreet services. "The man who brought it was very rude," Seol-Hwa continued, smoothing her hair with her father's jade pin. "He tried to put a knife in my neck while I was watching the koi fish. He wasn't very good at it. The shadows had to tidy up." The Prime Minister's hand tightened on his ceremonial fan. The wood creaked. "Assassins? In the palace? This is exactly why we need a stronger hand on the hilt of the nation, child. You aren't safe. The people are restless. Even your own servants turn against you." Seol-Hwa stopped chewing. The playful light in her large eyes didn't dim. It changed. It became the cold, flat reflection of a deep well. She took a step closer to Park, her small stature suddenly feeling like an impending mountain. "He wasn't my servant, Park," she whispered. The room went so quiet that the flickering of the torch flames sounded like roar. "He was wearing your seal. And he told me something very interesting before he stopped breathing." She looked around the room, making eye contact with every stubborn man there. The ministers felt a chill crawl up their spines. It wasn't the girl they were looking at. It was the exact expression the Iron Emperor wore before he ordered a purge. "He told me that you promised him the southern granaries as payment," she said, her voice dropping into a terrifying, melodic precision. "The grain that you told these honorable men was lost to the rot. It seems the rot isn't in the grain, Minister. It's sitting right here in the front row. Park's face went ash gray. He opened his mouth to speak, to patronize, to dismiss, but the words died in his throat. Seol-Hwa turned away, her skipping step returning as if she had never spoken. I'll be in the library. Send the cakes when you've finished voting on my incapacity. I'm curious to see which of you signs the paper first. She walked out, her spinning top clicking against the floor, leaving 50 of the most powerful men in the world trembling in a silence they couldn't break. The sun sat high over the imperial lotus gardens, casting long, peaceful shadows across the stone paths. Seol-Hwa sat on the edge of a marble fountain, her silk hem dipping into the water. To any servant passing by, she looked like a girl lost in a daydream, listlessly plucking petals from a flower and letting them drift into the koi pond. 10 paces behind her stood the 12 Silent Custodians. They were as still as the statues lining the perimeter, their obsidian armor absorbing the light. They did not speak. They did not breathe loudly. They were simply there, an unsettling reminder of the power Seol-Hwa supposedly didn't know how to use. The Minister of Works has a beautiful garden, Seol-Hwa murmured, her voice barely louder than the splashing water. She wasn't talking to the guards. She was talking to the air. But he spends so much time there. I wonder how he finds the hours, especially when the palace walls are crumbling in the north. A shadow moved behind a nearby weeping willow. A custodian leaned forward almost imperceptibly, then settled back. They had heard what she heard. He doesn't spend his time gardening, Majesty. A voice whispered from the shade of the willow. It was a palace maid, keeping her head low as she pretended to sweep the stone path. He spends his time receiving guests from the border clans. They bring him chests that are too heavy for 2 men to carry. They enter through the service gate at midnight. Seol-Hwa smiled, a bright, youthful expression that reached her eyes. Heavy chests? Perhaps they are full of very dense books. Minister Kim always did say he wanted to be a scholar. The books clink like silver, Majesty, the maid replied, then vanished into the greenery as a group of court officials approached. Seol-Hwa stood up, smoothing her robes. She looked like a child playing at being a queen. But as she walked toward the inner pavilion, she saw the Prime Minister's carriage arriving at the main gate. Park Geun-Shik stepped out, looking every bit the savior the people thought he was. He stopped to greet a group of junior ministers, his laughter booming, confident and paternal. He spotted Seol-Hwa and made a show of walking toward her. He didn't bow. He never did in private. "Still chasing butterflies, Seol-Hwa?" Park asked, his voice dripping with forced affection. "The Empire is in a fever, and you are worrying about the gardens. It's almost enviable, such innocence." Seol-Hwa looked up at him, her eyes wide. "The butterflies are the only things that don't lie to me, Prime Minister. They don't promise to protect me while holding a coin for an assassin." Park's smile didn't falter, but the skin around his eyes tightened. "You are still dwelling on that unfortunate incident. A misunderstanding. A rogue soldier. You shouldn't let it cloud your mind. A girl your age should be thinking of marriage, of alliances that could bring stability." "Marriage?" Seol-Hwa laughed, a high, clear sound. "And who would have me? I am so unserious, as you say. I would probably spend the dowry on candy and spinning tops." "There are many who would endure it for the sake of the throne," Park said, stepping closer. He lowered his voice, the warmth vanishing. "The people are hungry, Seol-Hwa. They see you here, playing in the water while they eat boiled leather. They are starting to ask why the emperor's blood is so thin. If you truly love your father's legacy, you will step aside before they come to the palace gates with fire." Seol-Hwa didn't blink. She reached out and straightened the silver pin on Park's lapel. Her hand was perfectly steady. "My father told me that the people only bring fire when they are cold," she said softly. "And they are only cold because someone stole their wood. I'm curious, Prime Minister, where did all the wood go?" Park pulled away, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. "Enjoy your garden while it lasts, Majesty. The autumn is coming, and dead leaves are always swept away." He turned and marched toward the council chamber. Seol-Hwa watched him go, her expression flat and unreadable. One of the silent custodians moved to her side. He didn't speak, but he handed her a small, rolled parchment. It was the list of the southern granary locations, the ones Park claimed were empty. Seol-Hwa tucked the parchment into her sleeve. The unserious girl was gone. In her place stood a wolf in silk. "He thinks I am a leaf," she whispered to the shadow. "He forgot that the root is still under the ground." She turned back to the pond, but she didn't pluck any more petals. She watched the koi swim, knowing that by tomorrow, the water in the palace would be much deeper than the Prime Minister expected. The morning mist had not yet cleared from the palace eaves when the drums of the High Court began to thrum. It was a summons usually reserved for declarations of war or the death of a sovereign. Inside the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the air was stagnant, choked by the scent of heavy incense and the collective anxiety of 100 men. The Prime Minister stood at the center of the mosaic floor, flanked by the Minister of War and the Minister of Justice. Between them sat a kneeling man, bound in heavy iron chains. He was a border captain, his face battered and his armor stripped of its rank. "Your Majesty," Park Geun-Shik called out, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Seol-Hwa sat upon the high throne, her feet barely reaching the floor. She was focused on a small silk pouch of dried plums, picking one out with delicate fingers. The silent custodian stood behind her, 12 pillars of obsidian that seemed to absorb the torchlight. "You called for me, Prime Minister?" Seol-Hwa asked, her voice light, almost bored. "The drums were very loud. I thought perhaps the kitchens had caught fire." "The Empire is on fire, Majesty," Park countered, gesturing to the prisoner. "This is Captain Han. He fled his post at the Northern Pass. Because of his cowardice, 3 villages were razed by mountain clans last night. The ministers demand justice. The law of your father demands his head." A murmur of agreement rippled through the ranks of the stubborn ministers. They looked at the girl on the throne with pity and impatience. They wanted blood to satisfy the people's anger, and they wanted a leader who wouldn't flinch at the sight of it. Seol-Hwa looked at the prisoner. The man was trembling, but his eyes weren't those of a coward. They were the eyes of a man who had seen a ghost. "The Northern Pass is a fortress," Seol-Hwa said, popping a plum into her mouth. "My father built it with stone from the Iron Mountains. How does a single captain allow it to fall?" "He opened the gates, Majesty," the Minister of War barked. "He sold the keys for gold. We found the coins in his quarters." "Is that true, Captain Han?" Seol-Hwa asked. The prisoner looked up, his voice cracking. "The gates were not opened by keys, Majesty. They were opened by hunger. My men had not eaten in 4 days. The supply wagons from the capital never arrived. We didn't flee. We collapsed. Park Geun-Shik laughed, a sharp, cold sound. A pathetic lie. The records show the grain was dispatched weeks ago. This man is simply trying to hide his treason behind the belly of his soldiers. The records, Seol-Hwa repeated. She stood up slowly. The silk of her robes hissed against the wood of the throne. Minister Park is very fond of records. They are so neat, so clean. She descended the stairs, her skipping step replaced by a slow, measured glide. She stopped in front of the Prime Minister, looking up at him. "I remember my father's stare," she said, her voice dropping into that chilling, resonant tone that made the minister's breath hitch. He used it when he knew a man was lying to him. He said a liar's eyes always move to the left when they speak of records. Park didn't move, but the muscle in his jaw stepped out. "Majesty, the law." "The law," she interrupted, "is not a blade for you to sharpen whenever you feel like killing the evidence of your own failure. Captain Han says the wagons didn't arrive. You say they did." She turned to the silent custodians. "Shadow, bring the black box." One of the guards stepped forward, carrying a small lacquered box. Seol-Hwa opened it and pulled out a single charred piece of wood. "This was found in the mud 10 miles south of the northern pass," she said, holding it up so the ministers could see. "It is the axle of a royal supply wagon. It was burned. Not by mountain clans, but by oil, the kind used only by the palace guard. My father taught me that fire doesn't happen by accident in the middle of a rainstorm." The hall became so silent, the sound of a distant crow could be heard outside. "The grain didn't disappear, Minister Park," Seol-Hwa said, her gaze locking onto the Prime Minister's eyes. "It was burned so that the North would fall, so that you could stand here today and demand strength while stepping on the neck of a loyal soldier. This is madness," Park hissed, his face flushing a deep, angry purple. "You are a child playing detective with a piece of charcoal. This proves nothing." "It proves I was watching while you thought I was playing," Seol-Hwa whispered. She turned back to the room, her aura expanding until she seemed to fill the entire hall. "Captain Han is to be released and fed. The Minister of War is to explain why his guards were seen 10 miles south of the pass with oil jars. And the Prime Minister—" She paused, a small, terrifying smile touching her lips. "The Prime Minister is going to help me find the rest of that grain. Since his records are so perfect, I'm sure he knows exactly where the rot began." She didn't wait for an answer. She walked back to the throne and picked up her bag of plums. "The meeting is over. I find the smell of burnt wood very tiresome." As the ministers watched her go, they didn't see a girl. They saw the Iron Emperor's shadow, and for the first time, the support for Park Geun-Shik began to crack like old parchment. The moon was a thin silver sliver over the palace eaves, casting long, distorted shadows across the stone courtyards. In the light of day, the palace belonged to the Prime Minister and his boisterous debates, but the night belonged to the 12 shadows. Seol-Hwa sat in her private library, the only light coming from a single flickering candle. She wasn't reading poetry or practicing calligraphy. She was staring at a map of the capital, spread across a low table. On the map were 12 small black stones, each placed over the manor of a different high minister. One by one, the silent custodians materialized from the darkness of the room. They did not announce their arrival. They simply appeared, their obsidian masks reflecting the candlelight like cold water. Each man placed a small scroll or a stolen token onto the table before receding back into the gloom. "The Minister of Justice," Seol-Hwa whispered, picking up a scroll. "He speaks of purity in the court, yet he has been forgiving the debts of the Southern Silk Lords in exchange for a 20% stake in their shipping lanes. He loves his gold more than his honor." She moved a black stone off the map. "The Minister of Rights," she continued, unrolling a second parchment. "He claims the gods are angry with my unserious nature. In reality, he is angry because my father's old laws prevent him from marrying his daughter into the Western clan. He wants a new king so he can have a new law." She moved another stone. The silent custodians were her eyes and ears, moving through the ventilation shafts, hanging from the rafters of tea houses, and standing behind silk screens while the ministers whispered their treasons. To the world, they were statues. To the ministers, they were the invisible witnesses of their sins. The door to the library creaked open. Seol-Hwa didn't move. She didn't hide the map. The Prime Minister walked in, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He didn't have his ceremonial fan tonight. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword. He looked at the 12 shadows standing in the corners of the room, their blades sheathed, but their presence suffocating. "It is late for a girl to be playing with stones, Seol-Hwa," Park Geun-Shik said, his voice a low growl. "The stones represent the pillars of the empire, Park," she replied without looking up. "I'm just checking to see which ones have termites." "You are playing a dangerous game," Park said, stepping into the circle of candlelight. "You humiliated the Minister of War today. You think those stubborn old men will follow a girl who treats them like criminals? They followed your father because he was a lion. They will crush you because you are a thorn." Seol-Hwa finally looked up. Her face was calm, but the switch was present in her eyes, a depth of focus that made Park's hand twitch on his sword. "They followed my father because he knew their names," Seol-Hwa said, "and I know their secrets. Tell me, Prime Minister, does Minister Kim know that you intend to replace him the moment you take the throne? Does the Minister of Justice know that the accidental fire in his warehouse last month was started by your men to keep him in debt to you?" Park's eyes widened. The air in the room seemed to vanish. You have been spying on your own court? This is the behavior of a tyrant, not an empress." "My father called it the Great Audit," she said, standing up. She walked around the table, her steps silent on the polished wood. "He said a ruler who doesn't know the heart of her servants is just a guest in her own house. I am not a guest, Park, and I am tired of the mess you've made. You have no proof that will hold in a public meeting," Park hissed, leaning over the table. "Secrets are just whispers until they are spoken. And no one in that hall will listen to a child over me." "Then we shall see who has the louder voice," Seol-Hwa said. She reached out and tipped over the largest black stone, the one representing Park's own manor. "The harvest is coming, Prime Minister, and I've spent all autumn gathering the grain you tried to hide." Park Geun-Shik stared at her, his face a mask of suppressed rage. He realized then that she hadn't been daydreaming in the garden for 3 years. She had been building a ledger in her mind, a map of every bribe, every lie, and every betrayal that held his power together. "The ministers fear me more than they love your father's memory," Park said, backing toward the door. "Remember that when you stand alone in the Great Hall." "I am never alone," Seol-Hwa said, glancing at the 12 shadows in the room. As Park slammed the door, Seol-Hwa turned back to the map. She picked up a small, blood-stained coin from her sleeve, the one she had shown the court, and placed it in the center of the table. One by one, she whispered to the silent custodians, the pillars will fall. Bring me the Minister of Right's secret correspondence with the Western clan. I want to see how much he thinks a crown is worth. The shadows shifted, and in an instant, the room was empty of everyone but the girl. She blew out the candle, leaving the palace in a darkness that only she knew how to navigate. The gates of the inner palace did not creak for Seol-Hwa. She used the narrow service tunnels designed for the removal of ash and waste. Clad in a coarse, undyed hemp tunic with a worn cloak pulled over her head, she looked like any other orphan of the capital's slums. Behind her, stripped of their obsidian armor and dressed in the rags of common laborers, moved 3 of the silent custodians. Even without their blades visible, their presence felt like a low-hanging storm cloud. As they moved away from the gilded spires of the central district, the air changed. The scent of sandalwood and roasting duck vanished, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of cold mud and the stagnant smell of unwashed bodies. This was the capital's outer ring, the place where the refugees of the manufactured famine came to die under the shadow of the walls they were no longer allowed to enter. Seol-Hwa stopped at a communal well where the water had turned a sickly, rusted brown. A line of people stretched for a mile, clutching broken ceramic jars. There was no talking. The silence here was different from the silence of the palace. It wasn't a choice, but a lack of breath. The Prime Minister told the court that the city was thriving. Seol-Hwa whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a cold, sharpening rage. He said the breadlines were a sign of healthy commerce. He counts the mouths, Majesty, but he does not feed them. One of the disguised custodians murmured at her shoulder. He waits for them to grow desperate enough to follow anyone who offers a handful of rice. He is building his army out of their hunger. Seol-Hwa walked deeper into the encampment. She saw a mother sitting against a collapsed cart, staring blankly at a child whose ribs were as visible as the spokes of a wheel. The girl reached into her cloak and pulled out a small cloth bundle, the honey candies and dried plums she usually snacked on during meetings. She stepped toward the mother, but a hand caught her wrist. It was a custodian. If you give them food now, Majesty, they will swarm you. We cannot protect your identity in a riot of the starving. Seol-Hwa looked at the soldier, her eyes turning into that heavy, imperial stare. Then we don't protect my identity. We protect them. She shook him off and knelt in the dirt before the woman. She didn't offer the candy with a smile. She offered it with the gravity of a debt being repaid. The woman's eyes flickered, her hand shaking as she took the sweets. The Emperor is dead, the woman croaked, her voice like grinding stones. The little girl on the throne. She doesn't know we are here. She is playing with flowers while we eat the dirt. Seol-Hwa felt a sting in her chest, more painful than any assassin's blade. She didn't correct her. She couldn't. She knows, Seol-Hwa said softly, her hand resting on the woman's ragged sleeve. She is just waiting for the right moment to burn the storehouses open. A commotion broke out at the end of the street. A squad of the palace guard, wearing the Prime Minister's silver-crested surcoats, rode in on sleek, well-fed horses. They began kicking over shelters and shouting for the filth to clear the road for a grain shipment heading to the western province. The grain wasn't for the people. It was being moved out of the city, right under their noses,
to be sold for gold that would fund the Prime Minister's coronation. Seol-Hwa watched as a guard raised a heavy whip over an old man who was too slow to move his crate of scraps. "Custodian," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "Majesty, break his hand. Do not kill him. Just make
sure he can never hold a whip again." The shadow at her side moved. It wasn't a fight. It was an erasure. The custodian blurred through the crowd, a silent streak of gray. There was a sickening crack, a muffled scream, and the guard fell from his horse, clutching a shattered wrist. In the chaos of the crowded street, no one saw the blow. The other guards looked around, panicked, seeing only a sea of hungry, resentful faces. "Retreat!" the lead guard shouted, sensing the sudden, dangerous shift in the atmosphere. The horses trampled through the mud as they fled back toward the inner gates. Seol-Hwa stood up, her cloak falling back to reveal the jade pin in her hair, the one thing she hadn't hidden. The old man looked up at her, blinking. For a second, he saw the glint of the imperial stone, the symbol of the Iron Emperor. "Go to the south gate at dawn," Seol-Hwa whispered to him. "Do not ask why. Just be there." As she turned to leave, she saw the silhouette of the palace on the horizon, glowing with artificial warmth. She realized that the trials and tribulations weren't a political game anymore. They were a slow-motion execution of her people. "He thinks I am a child playing in a garden," she said to the 12 shadows as they slipped back into the service tunnel. "He thinks I am afraid of the blood on the floor. He is wrong. I am the one who is going to make him drown in it." She didn't skip as she walked back to her library. She moved with the weight of 1,000 starving souls on her back, her mind already calculating the exact amount of grain needed to buy the loyalty of the city's garrison. The Great Council Chamber was an amphitheater of gold and cedar, designed to make the ruler look small and the law look eternal. Seol-Hwa sat on the high throne, her legs swinging rhythmically, her eyes focused on a small, intricate embroidery hoop. She was stitching a clumsy, lopsided butterfly while the Minister of Finance presented a report on the inevitable bankruptcy of the imperial treasury. Prime Minister Park Geun-Shik stood at the center of the hall, his thumbs tucked into his silk belt. He looked like a man who had already won. "And so, Majesty," Park concluded, his voice booming with a false, heavy grief, "we must authorize the sale of the southern iron mines to the Western Merchant Guild. Without that gold, we cannot pay the border guards. The empire will bleed from the edges inward." The ministers murmured, their heads bowing in somber agreement. They were tired of the trials. They wanted a solution, even if it meant selling the very bones of the nation. "Wait," Seol-Hwa said, her voice high and bright, cutting through the heavy atmosphere like a bird's chirp. She didn't look up from her embroidery. "I have a silly question. My father always said I was bad at math, but I was thinking about the grain wagons." Park stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "Majesty, we are discussing iron and gold. Grain is a matter for the lower bureaus." "But the grain wagons have wheels," Seol-Hwa continued, finally looking up. She offered him a wide, innocent smile. "And the Western Merchant Guild, the ones who want to buy our iron, they use the same wagons, don't they? The ones with the blue tarps?" "They are a logistics guild, Majesty. They use many wagons," Park said, his tone dripping with patronizing patience. "Right, logistics," she chirped. She hopped off the throne, her silk shoes pitter-pattering on the marble. She walked to the large logistical map in the center of the room, the 12 shadows trailing her like ink stains on a painting. "I was looking at the port taxes from last month. It says here that 300 blue-tarped wagons left the city heading west. But the Minister of Finance just said the West is too poor to buy our silk. So, what were the wagons carrying? The Minister of Finance shifted his weight, his forehead suddenly glistening. Empty crates, Majesty, to collect future harvests. Empty? Seol-Hwa's smile faded just a fraction. 300 wagons? That's a lot of wood and horse feed for empty air. Especially when I saw those same wagons being loaded near the southern granaries at midnight. They looked very heavy. The horses were sweating. Do empty crates make horses sweat, Prime Minister? The room went cold. The stubborn ministers began to look at each other. They weren't fools. They were men who had been waiting for a reason to doubt. You are mistaken, child, Park hissed, stepping into her space to loom over her. You are seeing shadows in the dark. You are confusing commerce with conspiracy. Am I? Seol-Hwa reached into the silk pouch at her waist. She didn't pull out a candy. She pulled out a small, leaden seal, the kind used to lock grain shipments for the Imperial Army. It was crushed, as if it had been hammered off a crate in a hurry. I found this in the mud near the west gate. It has the Imperial crest on one side and the Western Merchant Guild's mark on the other. She dropped the seal onto the map. It landed with a heavy, accusing ring. My silly math says that if you sell the people's grain to the West for private gold, and then tell the ministers the treasury is empty, so they'll let you sell the iron mines. You aren't just a prime minister, she whispered, her voice suddenly dropping into that resonant, terrifying switch. You're a liquidator. You're selling the Empire's heart to pay for the crown you haven't even stolen yet. This is an insult, the Minister of Finance shouted, though his voice cracked. You cannot accuse the High Council based on a piece of scrap metal. It isn't just scrap metal, Minister, Seol-Hwa said, turning her heavy gaze toward him. It's a confession. Because the Western Guild didn't pay in gold. They paid in promises of military support for a new regime. I have the ledgers, too. My shadows are very good at finding books that people try to burn. She looked back at Park, who was now deathly still. His hand was trembling, not with fear, but with the urge to strike. The iron mines aren't for sale, Seol-Hwa said, her voice echoing through the silent hall. And the grain wagons are being turned around as we speak. My custodians met them at the pass an hour ago. By morning, the city will have bread, and the Western Guild will have nothing but empty hands. She picked up her embroidery hoop and headed back toward the throne. If any of you want to discuss the budget further, I suggest you do it with the guards who are currently counting the gold in the Prime Minister's private cellar. I believe you'll find the missing national treasury there, tucked away under the floorboards. She sat back down, her feet swinging again. She took a needle and stabbed it through the silk butterfly with a decisive, sharp thwack. Now, does anyone else have a heavy business matter? Or can I go back to my garden? The lilies really are quite lovely today. Park Geun-Shik looked around the room and saw the faces of the ministers changing. The pity was gone. The doubt had turned into a sharp, jagged edge. He realized then that he wasn't fighting a girl. He was fighting the ghost of a king who had taught his daughter exactly how to gut a traitor without ever drawing a sword. The moon hung low and heavy over the palace, a sickle of cold light that seemed to watch the movements in the shadows. Seol-Hwa was not in her library. She sat in the center of her father's private meditation hall, a room of bare wood and the lingering scent of ancient cedar. She wore no jewelry, only the simple white hanbok of mourning. Behind her, the 12 silent custodians were not standing. They were kneeling, their black-handled blades laid flat on the floor before them. They were waiting for the storm. The paper doors slid open with a violent snap. Park Geun-Shik walked in alone. He had discarded his silver robes for a set of dark, functional leather armor. The false savior had finally dropped the pretense of the scholar. His face was a mask of jagged lines and desperation. "You think you've won because you found a ledger," Park said, his voice a jagged rasp in the silence. "You think the ministers will follow a girl who blackmails them? They are men of pride, Seol-Hwa. They would rather be led by a traitor they fear than a child who holds a mirror to their shame." Seol-Hwa didn't look up. She was slowly pouring tea into 2 small cups. "Pride is a heavy thing to carry when your stomach is empty, Park. The ministers are practical. They've realized that if they stay with you, they drown. If they stay with me, they simply have to be honest. It's a trade they are starting to like." "Honesty is for the dead," Park roared, stepping into the circle of light. "I am the only one who can keep the northern border from collapsing. I am the only one with the connections to the Western Guild. If you remove me, the Empire falls into chaos within a week. Is that what your father wanted? For you to burn the house down just to kill the rat in the walls?" Seol's switch was absolute. Her eyes were not those of a 17-year-old. They were deep, dark pools that seemed to contain the history of the entire dynasty. "My father didn't worry about the house," she said softly. "He worried about the foundation. And he knew you were the rot at the very base of it." Park laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "He knew? If he knew, why did he keep me by his side? Why did he let me hold the seal of the Prime Minister until his very last breath? He was weak at the entire, Seol-Hwa. He's a senile old man who couldn't see the knife eyes I was down." "He saw the knife," Seol-Hwa said. She stood up, her movements fluid and hauntingly similar to the Iron Emperor's. "He kept you close because he wanted to see how far you would go. He wanted to see every face you would buy, every heart you would corrupt. He used you as a lure to draw out all the filth in the court, so that one day I could sweep it away in a single stroke." Park stepped back, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword. "You're lying. He wouldn't risk the Empire on a gamble like that." "It wasn't a gamble. It was a lesson." Seol-Hwa walked toward him, ignoring the steel he began to draw from his scabbard. "On the night he died, when you were standing outside his door like a vulture, he whispered something to me. Do you want to know what it was?" Park stopped, the tip of his blade trembling. The fear he had buried for 3 years, the fear that the king had seen him, surfaced in his eyes. "He told me that a man who loves the throne more than the people will always leave a trail of blood," Seol-Hwa whispered, her voice vibrating with a power that seemed to shake the very walls. "He told me that you didn't just sabotage the granaries, Park. He told me that you were the one who poisoned his tea for 5 years, slowly draining his life, so you could step into his shadow." The silence that followed was absolute. Park's face went the color of bone. "He couldn't have known. The physicians said it was a wasting sickness." "He knew from the first year," Seol-Hwa said, her voice rising with a terrifying authority. "He drank the poison every day, just to buy me enough time to grow up. He traded his life for my education. He died so I could watch you think you were winning. He wanted me to see exactly how a traitor moves, so I would never be fooled again. I'll kill you, Park hissed, his eyes wild with the realization that his entire rise to power had been a stage managed by a dying man. I'll kill you and tell the court the shadows went mad. He lunged, the steel of his sword whistling through the air. He never reached her. In a blur of obsidian and silver, the 12 Silent Custodians were on their feet. 3 blades met Park's sword in midair, snapping the high-quality steel like it was glass. Before Park could even scream, he was pinned to the wooden floor. 3 black-handled swords held millimeters from his throat. Seol-Hwa didn't flinch. She didn't even move back. She looked down at the man who had tried to steal her birthright, her expression one of profound, cold pity. My father's last words weren't about hate, Park, she said, looking at the broken hilt of his sword. He told me, when the Prime Minister finally draws his sword against you, do not be angry. Be grateful, because that is the moment he has truly lost. She turned away, her white robes swirling like a ghost's. Shadow, take him to the iron dungeon. Do not let him speak to anyone. I want the ministers to see him in chains tomorrow morning, under the light of the sun he tried to eclipse. As the custodians dragged the struggling, silent Park Geun-Shik out of the hall, Seol-Hwa sat back down by her tea. Her hands were perfectly steady, but a single tear traced a path down her cheek, the only sign of the girl who had just finished her father's long, agonizing war. The iron gates of the palace did not snap shut that morning. They stayed wide, inviting a vulnerability that the Minister of War, General Cho, found irresistible. He marched through the outer courtyard with 500 of the capital's most elite soldiers, their silver-crested surcoats, the mark of the Prime Minister's favor, shining in the dawn light. Cho didn't believe in ghosts or teenage girls with auras. He believed in the weight of a spear. To him, Park Geun-Shik had been a genius who got caught in a net of his own hubris. Cho was here to cut the net. The Empress is a child playing with shadows, Cho shouted to his men, his voice bouncing off the high stone walls. She has arrested the Prime Minister on the word of ghosts. We take the throne today to save the Empire from a mad girl. The soldiers roared, their boots drumming a rhythm of impending slaughter. They reached the steps of the High Court, expecting to find the 12 shadows waiting to die in a final, bloody stand. Instead, they found the doors wide open. Seol-Hwa was standing in the center of the courtyard, alone. She wasn't wearing white anymore. She wore a deep, blood-red hanbok, the color of a setting sun. She was holding a small basket of oranges, peeling one with a small silver knife. General Cho, she called out, her voice echoing with a clarity that made the soldiers' horses whinny in discomfort. You're early for the assembly. The ministers haven't even finished their porridge. Cho halted his line, his hand gripping the hilt of his heavy broadsword. Step aside, Seol-Hwa. You are under the protection of criminals. The palace guard has been instructed to take you into custody for the safety of the state. The palace guard? Seol-Hwa asked, popping a slice of orange into her mouth. She looked around the empty courtyard. I don't see them. I only see your men, Cho. The ones who were supposed to be guarding the northern pass. Why are you here when the border is so thin? The border can wait until the capital is secure. Cho lunged forward, his men following. But as they crossed the threshold of the inner circle, a sound erupted from the rooftops. It wasn't a battle cry. It was the synchronized snap of 1,000 crossbows being cocked. From the eaves of the surrounding pavilions, the actual palace guard emerged. They weren't wearing the Prime Minister's silver crest. They had stripped them off, revealing the old, tarnished gold of the Iron Emperor's seal. Behind them stood the 12 Silent Custodians, positioned like gargoyles on the roof tiles. "I spent all night talking to the captains of the guard," Seol-Hwa said, her voice dropping into that resonant, terrifying switch. "I didn't offer them gold, Cho. I offered them the one thing you and Park forgot they had: a conscience. I showed them the burned axles of the supply wagons. I showed them the names of the men you left to starve at the North Pass." Cho looked up, his face pale. His 500 men were surrounded, trapped in a killing box of their own making. "They won't fire on us. We are brothers in arms." "They aren't firing on brothers," Seol-Hwa said, walking toward him. She didn't flinch as the soldiers leveled their spears at her chest. "They are firing on the men who stole the bread from their mothers' mouths. They are firing on the men who let the empire rot so they could wear silver thread." She stopped 3 paces from Cho. The tip of his sword was inches from her throat. "Kill me," she whispered, her eyes turning into dark, bottomless mirrors of his own fear. "Kill me, and see if a single one of your men makes it out of this courtyard alive. See if the people of this city leave enough of your body to bury." Cho's hand shook. He looked at his soldiers. They weren't looking at him for orders anymore. They were looking at the crossbows aimed at their heads, and then at the small, red-clad girl who didn't even blink at the cold steel against her skin. "Your father. He would have burned this city before he let it fall to a coup," Cho hissed, his voice trembling. "My father is dead," Seol-Hwa said, her voice a cold, sharp blade. "I am the one you have to deal with now. And I don't burn cities. I clean them." She reached out and placed her hand on the flat of his blade, pushing it down. Cho didn't resist. The weight of her gaze was heavier than any physical force he had ever encountered. "Drop your steel, General. Or stay here and become part of the pavement." In a clattering, discordant wave, the weapons of the 500 hit the stone. The coup had ended before a single drop of royal blood could be spilled. Seol-Hwa didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She simply turned back to her basket of oranges. "Shadow," she said to the air, "escort the general to join the Prime Minister. I believe they have a lot to discuss about safety and stability." As the palace guard descended to disarm the traitors, Seol-Hwa looked up at the 12 shadows on the roof. The unserious girl was gone. The transition was complete. She had not only survived the fire, she had redirected the heat to consume her enemies. The Hall of 10,000 Years was a cathedral of judgment. 200 ministers sat in rows of absolute, suffocating silence, their eyes fixed on the empty throne. The morning sun bled through the high, narrow windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced over the blood-stained gold coin still resting on the central table. It had not been moved since Seol-Hwa dropped it there. The doors did not creak this time. They swung open with a violent, regal finality. Seol-Hwa entered. She was no longer wearing the playful silks of a girl, nor the red of a revolutionary. She wore the heavy,
midnight blue ceremonial robes of the sovereign, stiff with gold embroidery that depicted the dragons of her father's house. On her head sat the Myeon Sagwan, its 12 strings of jade beads clinking softly with every step. The weight of it should have crushed her small frame, but she carried it with a stillness that made the very air in the hall feel thin. Behind her, the 12 Silent Custodians did not hide. They marched in 2 columns of 6, their black blades sheathed, but their hands resting on the hilts. They were the punctuation marks to her presence. Seol-Hwa did not skip. She did not look for candy. She walked to the center of the hall, stopped before the map of the empire, and looked at the men who had spent 3 years praying for her failure. "The Prime Minister is in the Iron Dungeon," she began. Her voice was not high. It was a resonant, low-timbered chime that reached every corner of the room. "The Minister of War is beside him. The coup was settled before the sun hit the palace roof. Now we are left with the most difficult part of the morning: the truth." Minister Han, the oldest and most stubborn of the council, stood up. His hands shook as he leaned on his staff. "Majesty, you speak of truth, but we see only chaos. You have arrested the
pillars of our government. The people are starving, the borders are failing, and you bring us theater?" Seol-Hwa turned her gaze toward him. The switch was so absolute that Minister Han stumbled back half a step. "The pillars were hollow, Minister Han," Seol-Hwa said. "They were filled with the grain that should have been in the people's mouths." "You speak of the borders failing?" "They failed because Park Geun-Shik sold the locations of our hidden passes to the Western Guild for the price of a silver-threaded robe." She gestured to a shadow, who stepped forward and unfurled a massive scroll onto the floor. It was the Prime Minister's personal ledger, not the one he showed the court, but the one he kept in his vault. "This is the ledger of the trials," Seol-Hwa said. "Every famine, every skirmish, every accident that made you fear for the empire was recorded here as a victory for Park's ascension. He didn't want to save the empire. He wanted to inherit its corpse." A roar of denial rose from a small faction of Park's remaining loyalists, but Seol-Hwa didn't shout over them. She simply waited. Her silence was more intimidating than their noise. When the room settled into an uneasy quiet, she spoke again. "I know why you supported him," she said, her voice softening with a cold empathy. "You loved my father. You feared his work would die with a girl who liked butterflies. You thought Park was the only one strong enough to hold the sword. You weren't being traitors. You were being cowards. You chose a strong lie over a difficult truth." She walked toward the first row of ministers, her beads clinking. "But the sword doesn't belong to the strongest arm," she whispered, stopping in front of a minister who had once called for her abdication. "It belongs to the hand that is willing to bleed for the people. My father bled for 5 years while he was being poisoned. He stayed alive just long enough to make sure I knew every one of your names. He knew who took the bribes. He knew who looked away while the granaries burned." She looked back at the hall. "I have the names. I have the proof. I could execute half this room before noon and be within my father's law." The terror in the room was a physical thing. Men who had survived wars clutched their robes, their faces turning the color of ash. "But I am not my father," Seol-Hwa said. She reached up and unpinned the jade pin from her hair.
the one the Iron Emperor had given her. She laid it on the table beside the blood-stained coin. He was a man of justice. I am a woman of the future. The empire cannot survive on blood alone. It needs grain. It needs iron. And it needs ministers who are more afraid of their conscience than they are of a prime minister. She turned back to the throne. Park Geun-Shik will be executed at sunset for high treason and the murder of the emperor. General Cho will follow him. For the rest of you, the trials are over. The southern granaries are being opened today. The iron mines stay with the people. She began to climb the stairs to the throne, each step heavy and deliberate. When she reached the top, she didn't sit immediately. She turned to face the assembly. If you wish to follow me, stay. If you wish to join Park in the dirt, stand up now and draw your blades. I have 12 men behind me who have been waiting a long time to see if any of you were actually brave. Not a single minister stood. Not a single breath was heard. Minister Han was the first to sink to his knees. He didn't do it out of fear of the shadows. He did it because when he looked at Seol-Hwa, he saw the glory of the dynasty restored in the eyes of a girl he had dismissed. One by one, the 200 most powerful men in the nation bowed until their foreheads touched the cold marble. Long live the Empress, they chanted, their voices a low, trembling thunder. Seol-Hwa sat on the throne. She didn't smile, she didn't skip. She looked out over the bowed heads of her enemies and her allies, her mind already moving toward the reconstruction of a shattered world. The fate of the dynasty had changed. The little girl was gone. There was only the Empress. The sky over the capital was the color of a bruised plum as the sun began its final descent. This was the hour Park Geun-Shik had planned for his coronation. Instead, it was the hour of his erasure. The courtyard of the iron dungeon was silent, save for the dry rustle of the wind through the dead vines on the walls. There was no grand audience, no jeering crowd. Seol-Hwa had denied the Prime Minister the spectacle he craved. She stood in the center of the yard, her midnight blue robes dark against the fading light. Park knelt before her, his silver hair matted with grime, his hands bound with the same heavy iron he had once used to shackle his enemies. "You look small in the dirt, Park," Seol-Hwa said. Her voice carried no malice, only a cold, clinical observation. Park looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "The people will
forget you, Seol-Hwa. They will remember the famine. They will remember the fear. You are just a child holding a broken vase together with her bare hands." "They won't remember the fear," Seol-Hwa replied, stepping closer until her shadow completely eclipsed him. "Because I am giving them back the one thing you stole. Their tomorrow. You thought the empire was a prize to be owned. I know it is a burden to be carried." She turned to the lead custodian and gave a single, sharp nod. The black blade did not catch the light as it rose. It was a sliver of void. "My father is waiting," she whispered. She did not stay to watch the steel fall. She turned her back and walked toward the palace gates, her steps rhythmic and certain. Behind her, the heavy thud of the finality of a 30-year ambition echoed off the stone, followed by a silence that felt like the first clean breath the palace had taken in years. By the time Seol-Hwa reached the outer gates, the moon had risen. She did not use the service tunnels tonight. She commanded the great vermilion gates, the ones reserved only for the emperor's return from war, to be thrown wide. A massive crowd had gathered in the muddy square beyond the walls. They were the hungry, the forgotten, and the terrified. They saw the golden lanterns of the imperial procession and cowered, expecting the palace guard to drive them back with whips. Instead, the 12 shadows stepped forward, sheathing their swords. They moved to the massive supply wagons that had been turned back from the western border. With a single, synchronized motion, they sliced the ropes. The blue tarps fell away to reveal mountains of golden grain, dried meats, and crates of medicine. "The Empress!" a voice cried out from the darkness. Seol-Hwa walked out from the shadow of the gatehouse. She was not on a horse. She was on foot, her ceremonial jade beads clicking softly. She walked straight into the mud of the outer ring, her expensive silk hems soaking up the filth of the slums. She stopped before the same woman she had met days ago, the mother with the hollow-cheeked child. Seol-Hwa reached into a grain sack, filled a wooden bowl to the brim, and handed it to her. "The grain was never lost," Seol-Hwa said, her voice carrying through the square. "It was only waiting for a hand honest enough to give it back." The woman looked at the bowl, then at the girl whose face was now illuminated by the torches of the palace guard. She didn't see a child playing dress-up. She saw the hidden dragon who had breathed fire and turned the winter back into spring. One by one, the people began to sink to their knees in the mud. It wasn't the forced submission of the ministers in the Great Hall. It was the heavy, tearful gratitude of a nation that had been saved from the brink of the abyss. Seol-Hwa stayed in the square for hours. She didn't delegate. She didn't hide behind her warriors. She stayed until her robes were ruined and her hands were dusty with flour. She talked to the elders about the planting season. She listened to the widows. She acted as if the throne were nothing more than a chair, and the empire was simply a family that needed tending. As the first light of dawn began to touch the spires of the palace, Seol-Hwa stood at the edge of the city, looking out toward the northern pass. The trials and tribulations were far from over. The borders were still weak, the treasury was still thin, and the Western Guild would surely seek revenge. But as she felt the weight of her father's jade pin in her hair, Seol-Hwa knew the fate of the dynasty was no longer a tragedy. "The sun is rising," she murmured to the silent custodian at her side. "Yes, Majesty," the shadow replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, the first time he had spoken in 3 years. "It is a new day." Seol-Hwa turned back toward the palace, her skip returning for just a moment before she corrected it into the stride of a queen. She had changed the fate of an empire not with a sword, but with the terrifying power of a girl who refused to be told she was small. The little empress had come home.